And we're back with Chapter 11 of Core Justice. Let's jump in. Chapter 11, Cal Stokes Sr. Cal's father was a rising star in the Marine Corps during the First Gulf War in the early 90s. He'd been commissioned in 1971 just as the Vietnam War was in full swing. After attending the basic school, he'd been shipped first to Okinawa, Japan, and then to Vietnam. He commanded a platoon and earned a Purple Heart and a Silver Star during his 2 tours. Cal remembered how his father had described those times, patrolling the paddies and jungles of Vietnam. It was also where he'd learned the importance of 2 things: completing the mission and taking care of his Marines. It was a lesson he carried on in all aspects of his life until the day he died. Throughout the 70s and 80s, Cal Sr. moved up through the ranks while at the same time moving his small family, all over the world. There were stints in Camp Pendleton, Monterey, Okinawa, Camp Lejeune, Nashville for recruiting duty, and more. Along the way, he and Cal's mother, Denise, bore a healthy and rambunctious little boy. Cal had enjoyed his early days on Marine Corps bases. Living on a military base had its perks: a high level of security for family, a large number of young children to play with, good prices for food, and a solid school system. It was a life you could get used to. Needless to say, over the years, Cal Sr. did more deploying than fathering. That wasn't to say that he was a bad father. Actually, the opposite was the case. He cherished his time at home with his family and son and took full advantage of being on leave. As Cal closed in on his teenage years, tensions increased in the Middle East, culminating in Iraq's invasion of neighboring Kuwait. He remembered watching the footage with his mother, both knowing that it was only a matter of time before Colonel Stokes would lead his Marines into battle. Sure enough, orders were quickly passed down through the ranks, and Cal Sr. headed to war, commanding his regiment of Marines. Left at home, Cal's behavior took a nosedive. In retrospect, Cal understood that the way he'd acted was his method of dealing with the possibility that his father could die. First, it was talking back in school. Then it was a fight with one of his classmates. Finally, Cal was arrested by the Camp Lejeune military police when he got caught breaking into the PX at 2 a.m. trying to steal cigarettes. Cal's mother was devastated. Not only was her husband at war, her only son was now a criminal. Word travels fast on Marine bases, and this was no exception. Mrs. Stokes soon received a request by the base commanding general to come for lunch. The wives of Marine colonels do not get invited to lunch with generals. If anything, it would have been the general's wife doing the inviting. Again, not so in this case. Mrs. Stokes arrived at the commanding general's quarters the next day. She was ushered in by the general's aide. General Willard met her at the entrance to the dining room. "Nice to see you again, Denise." "Thank you for having me," she said demurely. "Why don't we have a seat? Gunny Fred is about to bring out some club sandwiches. Does that sound okay?" "That would be fine." The two moved to the dining room table. The leaves had all been taken out, and what could at times seat 20 officers and wives now could only seat 6 diners total. They both sat down, and the food followed shortly. The general made small talk as they ate. 10 minutes later, they were both finished, and General Willard really began. "Denise, I just wanted to have you by so I could make sure everything's going okay at home. I know how trying it is to have Colonel Stokes overseas. Add to that the mischief Cal Jr.'s been getting into, and I know you've got your hands full." More than anything at that moment, Denise Stokes, a proud Southern woman and wife of a Marine colonel, was embarrassed and frightened. She'd always enjoyed the evenings at the officers' club, mingling with the other wives. This was something entirely different. To be summoned to the throne room was unbearable. "General, I know there's nothing that can fix what my son has done. I only ask that he be given the punishment he deserves, and maybe he'll learn his lesson. I will say that I've tried my best, but sometimes teenage boys don't want to listen to their mothers." "I appreciate you saying that, Denise," said General Willard. "You do, however, realize that Cal Jr. is part of the Marine family, and as a Marine, I have a duty to help." "I understand," she said. "How about I have a little talk with the boy? Maybe even give him a tour of the local juvenile detention facility. I know the warden pretty well, and he's happy to help me keep our kids on the straight and narrow." "If you think that would help, I'd be much obliged." General Willard nodded sharply. "Consider it done." He turned to the door and yelled for his aide, "Captain Nelson!" Captain Nelson walked into the room. "Yes, General?" "Please schedule to have my driver pick up young Calvin from the Stokes residence tomorrow morning at 0600. Bring him to the PT field and I'll take him back with me to the office. Yes, sir. General Willard turned back to Mrs. Stokes. Well then, Denise, please don't hesitate to call if you need anything. Anything at all. Thank you, sir. She sincerely hoped she would never have to call the general. She picked up her pocketbook and made her way to the door. The next morning, right at 0600, Calvin Stokes Jr. was waiting with his mother on the front step of their two-story home. He wore his best Sunday khaki slacks with a white button-down shirt. His hair was buzz-cut as he'd worn it during the past year, and the look of anger and dejection was evident on his face. The night before, when his mother had arrived at home, she delivered the news. A screaming match ensued, ending with Cal slamming his bedroom door in her face. Temper tantrum or not, he was ready for the general's driver at 0530. He knew the alternative. Without an appetite, he waited quietly, glaring at his mother as she casually eaten her own breakfast. A government vehicle pulled up at 0600, and what looked to be a 6'5" Marine sergeant stepped out of the driver's seat. He was dressed in firmly creased utilities and marched smartly to the door. The sergeant had a baritone voice. Mrs. Stokes? There I go, trying to do voices. Don't let me do it. Yes, Sergeant, I'm Mrs. Stokes. Is the young Mr. Stokes ready to go? He sure is, Sergeant. I appreciate you coming out here to get him. Not at all, ma'am. You ready to go, son? Cal sounded nervous when he answered. Yes, sir. Don't call me sir, son. You can call me Sergeant Krause. Yes, Sergeant Krause. Well, let's get going. The general's waiting. He walked back to the car and held the back door open for Cal. Cal slid in the back seat and fastened his seatbelt. Sergeant Krause waved goodbye to Cal's mother and walked around the car into the driver's seat. Again, probably maybe more description than I really need to have. These days, I probably wouldn't describe that. Krause started the car and they began their trek. Cal looked back to his mother, still standing on the front step. Too mad and embarrassed to move, he didn't even wave back. The next 8 hours were torture for Cal. Sergeant Krause picked up the general at the PT field and then took the pair back to the headquarters building. The whole way, not a word was spoken to Cal, who sat sullen in the back. All his bluster from the night before had evaporated. After a stern talking to while standing at attention in front of the general's desk, he was taken by the ever-present Sergeant Krause to the juvenile detention facility just off base in Jacksonville, North Carolina. There the warden, stone-faced but cordial, instructed his staff to get Cal dressed in a prison jumpsuit. He changed into the oversized outfit under the disapproving glare of 2 male and 1 female guard. Then the warden, followed closely by Sergeant Krause and the 3 prison guards, gave Cal a careful tour of the entire facility. Cal saw the looks on the faces of the kids serving time. Some looked scared, some looked resigned, others just looked like career criminals. By the end of the 2-hour tour, Cal knew he never wanted to return. Although the shock of the prison tour seemed effective for the short term, Cal soon fell into his old routines. This go-around, however, he did a better job covering his tracks. He no longer committed outright mischief. Instead, he skirted the rules and bent them to his will. Even at a young age, Cal excelled in academics. He'd enjoyed a challenge and far outpaced his classmates. He now used his mind to mold the rules as he saw fit. He was never again caught for any overt acts of fighting or stealing, but he would return home with smoke and beer on his breath. His mother could never prove it. His behavior remained poor until Cal's father returned from war. The homecoming was more of a relief to Mrs. Stokes than to Cal. He waited with a mixture of fear and anger as his parents discussed his fate. Looking back, Cal knew his disruptive attitude was a kid's way of coping with an absent father, but even in the midst of the turmoil, deep down he knew he'd crossed the line. That did not, however, mean he would beg for forgiveness. It wasn't his fault that his father had gone off to war. Colonel Stokes received the news with a strange calm. He had already been tipped off by a friend on the commanding general's staff, so he knew the majority of Cal's infractions. Coming home from his second war, Cal Sr. understood the actions of young men. When given the chance, they would excel beyond anyone's imagination. Left alone without proper guidance, young boys could just as easily fall on the wrong side of the tracks. Colonel Stokes understood why Cal had misbehaved. It didn't make it right, but it was what it was. So, although his star shined bright within the Marine Corps, Colonel Stokes personally delivered his retirement papers to the commander of the 2nd Marine Division the next day. The general did his best to set Cal Sr. against his chosen path, but the Marine, and more importantly, the father, would not be dissuaded. Colonel Stokes knew it was time to spend more time with his family. The Stokes family packed up and relocated back to Nashville, Tennessee, a few weeks later. Through teary goodbyes with lifelong friends, and an emotional change of command ceremony where Colonel Stokes was awarded the Legion of Merit and a Bronze Star, the Stokes clan moved on, uncertain of the future. Cal Sr. used his considerable accrued leave time to reach out to his numerous contacts in the civilian world. Throughout his time in the Corps, he'd come in contact with various influential individuals, both on the national and local scene. Although his skills from the Marine Corps didn't equate to one particular job in the civilian world, not many regiments to command on Main Street, USA, his Marine determination knew he would find something. He spent his days making phone calls and his nights and weekends with the family. Most time devoted to the family found Cal and his father bonding and figuring out each other. There were camping and fishing trips. All the while, Cal's father treated his son like a man and started to relay life's lessons. Cal's spirits and attitude improved. He'd needed his father, and once again things felt right in the world. Not long after settling in the Nashville suburb of Franklin, Tennessee, Cal Sr. was hired by a local government facility as a consultant to evaluate the facility's security and operations. The contract had been arranged by an old friend, now serving at the Pentagon, who had sung Cal Sr.'s praises to the regional director in charge of all of Tennessee State's federal facilities. Not sure if that really makes sense, but whatever. Although he'd never done anything like what he'd been hired for, the money was right, and like a true Marine, he'd figure it out as he went. Long story short, after evaluating the facility, interviewing employees, cataloging procedures, and simply observing for 6 weeks, Colonel Stokes delivered his 30-page summary to the regional director. The director was very pleased with the recommendations and asked Cal Sr. to stay on board to help implement his suggestions. Cal's father didn't want to be employed by the government, so instead he asked if a new consulting contract could be drafted for the follow-up work. The director agreed, and Cal Sr. spent the good part of the next 6 months retraining the facility staff and implementing the upgraded security protocol. During the entire process, he made it absolutely clear that the job would not interfere with his home life. He insisted on leaving no later than 4:30 each day in order to spend time with Cal. It was a habit that he'd continue until the day he died. Throughout his first consulting gig, Cal Sr. began to see the possibilities in the world of national and international security. He'd recognized the rise of international terrorist cells during his time in the Marine Corps. He'd lost friends in the Beirut bombing. Colonel Stokes knew it wouldn't be long before those attacks hit American soil. Over the next couple years, he formalized the structure of Stokes Security International. He leveraged his abundant contacts within state and federal agencies to help win jobs that included law enforcement training, security analysis, VIP protection, etc. Over time, his staff grew, as did his reputation for being absolutely dependable. He refused jobs that would take him away for long periods of time. He refused offers from certain Middle Eastern governments with reported ties to developing terrorist organizations. While no longer an active duty Marine, Cal Stokes still felt an intense desire to protect and defend the United States. Along the way, he hired former military officers and enlisted men to be part of the growing SSI. He soon became known within certain circles as the man who gave second chances. Cal Stokes knew from experience that everyone had at least one bad day, and sometimes good troops fall by the wayside. His first second chance hire, strangely enough, was Cal's cousin, Travis. At the time, Travis was a Navy lieutenant serving as platoon commander with the SEALs, a highly intelligent young man, Rhodes Scholar in college, and an impressive athlete who'd started as defensive back on the Ole Miss football team for 4 years. Travis seemed to be on the fast track to Navy stardom. That all changed when he found out that one of his SEALs was beating his wife. A deeply honorable man, Travis confronted the enlisted man. During the short conversation, the SEAL admitted to abusing his wife and told Travis it wasn't any of his business. Although the sailor outweighed Travis by almost 50 pounds, he still found himself waking up inside a San Diego hospital with a broken arm, a dislocated shoulder, a cracked jaw, 4 broken ribs, a broken leg, and one hell of a headache, and a partridge in a pear tree. Travis, after calling the ambulance, turned himself into the shore patrol and was confined at the brig until the unconscious SEAL could wake up and testify against his platoon commander. The man decided not to press charges, but the damage had already been done. By turning himself in, Travis had admitted his guilt. There was nothing the special operations community could do except let him leave the Navy quietly. At least it was better than spending more time in the brig. Cal Sr. found out about the incident from his brother, Travis's father, who, incidentally, I don't think I've ever mentioned again. He invited Travis to fly out. This is Colonel Stokes, invited Travis to fly out to Nashville to spend a little time with family. During the 2-week stay, Cal's father introduced Travis to the inner workings of SSI. He never made it seem like he was courting a new employee. Instead, he quizzed Travis on how SSI could improve its operations. By the end of the visit, without prompting, Travis made up his mind. He asked his uncle if he could join the company. He explained that he would rather sweep floors for his uncle's company than to beg for work elsewhere. I can turn the page here. Needless to say, Cal Sr. took him up on his offer. Instead of starting Travis as he'd requested on the bottom of the totem pole, the CEO of SSI took Travis under his wing. For the first year, he rarely left Cal Sr.'s side. Some people called Travis the bodyguard, but he served as more of an aide and apprentice. Travis would later admit that the time spent with his uncle and his family probably saved him from a depressive fate. Never a word was said by the rest of the company's staff other than to give the new man a friendly ribbing. Many within SSI came from similar backgrounds and circumstances. It was the former Marine turned CEO who had helped many of his staff over the years. They respected their leader's decision and believed in his vision. The second and probably more important reason was that the entire company harbored a deep and open respect for the Stokes family. Colonel Stokes was a tough man, but a fair man. He always made time for his family and was known for walking the halls and kicking his employees out so they could spend time with their own loved ones. Every person up and down the chain felt like they had earned the title of SSI employee. The feeling was very similar to the young man crossing the parade deck and finally being called a Marine. It was an atmosphere that Cal Stokes worked hard to foster from the beginning. Other key players in the SSI family also came from employment similar to Cal's cousins. There was a logistics chief, Martin Farmer, a former Marine Master Sergeant who'd been relieved of duty after falling into deep alcoholism and depression upon coming home from deployment to find his wife sleeping with a Marine next door. There had been no violence, only the swift decline of a man once revered by his peers and now hindered by the bottle. Farmer's crusty old Sergeant Major was the one to give Colonel Stokes the heads up. The Sergeant Major and the Colonel had served together on 2 separate occasions and held each other in high regard. So, when the phone call came from his former Marine, Colonel Stokes was glad to help. He'd reviewed the Master Sergeant's record that, minus the present problem, was exemplary, including 2 meritorious promotions. Next, he hopped a flight to Camp Lejeune and was formally introduced by the Sergeant Major. Colonel Stokes recognized the pain in the man's eyes and made a deal with him. He would pay for the man's rehabilitation and counseling. At the end of the program, if Farmer came out clean, he would be hired at SSI. Like most Marines, Master Sergeant Farmer was a proud man and fully appreciated the helping hand he'd received. He flew through recovery and reported into work 90 days later, right after a brief stop in North Carolina to finalize his divorce. Master Sergeant Farmer became one of Cal Sr.'s brightest stars and totally revamped SSI's logistics division. It seemed early on that Colonel Stokes had an eye for talent. All along the way, Cal Jr. became a welcome aide to the SSI at CEO. He'd often sit in on high-level meetings and interviews. Sometimes he was in the room, other times he was next door listening through the conference intercom system. Cal learned that his father was a special man that invested in his fellow man first in order to better himself and others. That's a weird sentence. Cal learned that his father was a special man that invested in his fellow man first in order to better himself and others. That makes more sense. Cal learned that his father had a special place in his heart for those in need of a second chance, but that second chances always came with stipulations. Cal Sr.'s sense of morality was strong when it came down to the activity that caused any potential employee to get into trouble. He remembered the time an old friend had gone out on a limb for a certain Navy Master Chief. Apparently, the two didn't quite know each other, but somehow the Master Chief knew enough to get referred to Colonel Stokes. This story Cal Sr. received from his old friend differed drastically from the story that finally came out of the ill-fated Master Chief's mouth. Apparently, the sailor believed that any first infraction warranted a second chance in the mind of the founder of SSI. He soon found out otherwise. It quickly surfaced that the man had twisted his story in order to gain sympathy with his former commander. The commander, an old friend of Colonel Stokes, took the man for his word and was more than happy to pass along a supposedly trustworthy sailor to his buddy. It turned out that the man had severely beaten two young sailors who just reported into his unit. Apparently, alcohol was involved, and what started as an innocent hazing ritual soon turned violent. Sitting in front of Colonel Stokes, it was obvious the sailor still held no remorse for the situation. He actually had the audacity to blame the Navy for accusing him unjustly. Little did the man know that Colonel Stokes held no room in his world for bullies or liars. The man was swiftly escorted out by Travis and two other former SEALs, and a report was submitted to Colonel Stokes' friend, which he then filed with the Navy. It was during this altercation that Cal finally understood his father's true sense of right and wrong. He believed that any abuse or offense against a lesser human being was morally wrong. At the same time, Cal Sr. did believe that there were times when a man must take the law into his own hands, as long as it was the right thing to do. Cal asked his father about this supposed duplicity, and he listened as Cal Sr. calmly explained that although America was the best country in the world, even America's laws were not always fair to all, and oftentimes sheltered criminals for the sake of due process. His son knew his father approved certain covert missions for various government agencies that, if seen by the liberal media, or the media in general, would be criticized as being barbaric and unconstitutional. Each of these undertakings was always scrutinized for its ethical basis by the headquarters team at SSI. A mission was never green-lighted if the outcome and the methods did not live up to SSI's high moral standard. Colonel Stokes would later solidify his belief with a motto he would dub Core Justice. So, that was a longer chapter about Colonel Stokes, Cal Sr., Calvin Sr., whatever you want to call him, Cal's dad. There's a lot of what I experienced in the Marine Corps and the Navy, being a Navy brat, a son of a naval officer. As I mentioned before, I love my time on bases. It was a fun place to grow up. Lots of other kids, lots of new kids, lots of people moving away, but it was a safe place. It was a great place to grow up. And while I wasn't the hellion that Cal was, I understand why he was, and I knew plenty of kids like that. But hopefully you like their story, and we got more coming, so stay tuned.